When the anxious stops chasing the avoidant, there comes a moment in every anxious person's life, whether they know the attachment theory or not, when they get tired. Not just physically, but emotionally. Tired of sending the first message, tired of wondering where they stand, tired of constantly proving their worth to someone who won't meet them halfway. That moment is freedom, because when the anxious stops chasing the avoidant, they don't just stop texting first, they stop begging for breadcrumbs and start demanding the whole meal. They stop mistaking emotional unavailability for mystery. They stop turning anxiety into chemistry. And the avoidant, they feel the shift, because the anxious was doing the emotional labor for two. And when that stops, silence gets loud. They either step up or the dynamic dies. But here's the most powerful parting. When the anxious stops chasing the avoidant, something even more important happens. They begin chasing themselves. They chase their peace, their boundaries, their standards. They stop auditioning and start hiring. They realize love should feel like a safe place to land, not a battlefield. Because the truth is, healing doesn't always look like fixing a broken relationship. Sometimes it looks like walking away from it with your head held high and choosing finally to be with someone who chooses you back, without fear, without games, and without delay. When someone with an anxious attachment style is in a relationship with someone avoidant, it often starts with a strong pull, a feeling of intense chemistry, excitement, and the sense that this person is finally quit. But what's really happening underneath the surface is a dynamic that plays on the deepest fears of the anxious partner, the fear of abandonment, of not being enough, of being too much. In the beginning, they might overlook the signs, the delayed texts, the emotional distance, the discomfort with intimacy. All of it is rationalized as the avoidant needing space, or just being different. But over time, the anxious person starts doing more and more of the emotional work. They initiate the conversations, they smooth over conflicts, they reassure, they ask the hard questions while tiptoeing around them at the same time. It becomes a pattern of chasing connection while being met with resistance. This constant effort becomes exhausting. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, like carrying a weight you don't notice until your arms are shaking. The anxious partner starts to feel resentful. They wonder why they're the only one showing up. They lie awake analyzing messages, second-guessing their tone, wondering if they were too much or not enough. And yet, they keep trying because deep down they believe if they just do the right thing, say the right thing, or love hard enough, the avoidant person will come closer. They confuse emotional labor with love. But love shouldn't feel like anxiety. Eventually, exhaustion turns into clarity. The anxious person begins to realize they are trying to control the uncontrollably, another person's willingness to show up emotionally. They see that no amount of chasing can make someone stay who is committed to avoiding closeness. And it's in that moment, when they are finally to keep punishing, that something internal shifts. They stop texting first, not play a game, but because they no longer have the energy to beg for connection. They stop analyzing every interaction because the pattern has become painfully obvious. They stop showing up in ways that cost them their self-worth. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. It's not about building walls. It's about recognizing the cost of overfunctioning in a relationship where your needs are treated like inconveniences. It's the emotional burnout that leads to the turning point. And ironically, it's in the moment of letting go that the anxious person often finds their power. Not because the avoidant changes, but because they finally realize they don't need to keep suffering in the hope that one day they will. This moment of emotional burnout isn't a breakdown. It's a breakthrough. It's the beginning of seeing love not as something to earn through anxiety, but something that should come with mutual effort and ease. It's not weakness to admit you're tired. It's wisdom. And from that tired place, a new kind of strength is born. When someone with an anxious attachment style decides to stop chasing an avoidant partner, the entire dynamic between them begins to unravel. It's not just about stepping back or taking a break. It's a quiet revolution. What was once an imbalanced system where one person did most of the emotional labor suddenly becomes exposed for what it really is: unsustainable. The anxious person has typically spent the relationship adapting, reading between the lines, initiating closeness, managing their partner's discomfort with intimacy, and trying to create security in a space where none was being consistently offered. But the moment they stop chasing, the avoidant no longer has someone to quietly rely on for the connection they pretend not to need. Avoidants tend to fear engulfment and are hypersensitive to perceived control. So when someone pulls away emotionally, they often feel a sense of relief. At first, they interpret it as space being given. But over time, something else happens. Without the anxious partner initiating contact, checking in, or making plans, the emotional vacuum begins to grow, and the avoidant, who has been comfortably distant, starts to notice the silence. The comfort of distance starts to feel like abandonment, even if they won't admit it. This discomfort is the mirror that forces them to face the fact that connection has to be mutual. You can't be distant and still expect closeness. When the anxious partner pulls back, not to manipulate, because they're exhausted and have finally prioritized their peace, it acts like a reset button. All the coping mechanisms that maintain the relationship dynamic, like over-apologizing, over-explaining, or constantly accommodating, suddenly vanish, and the avoidant is left with what they've contributed, often very little. It becomes apparent that without one person doing all the work, there is no relationship. This revelation can be sobering. More importantly, the person with the anxious attachment begins to see the truth more clearly. They realize that what they thought was connection was actually codependency, that the constant pursuit of reassurance was not mutual bonding, it was survival mode. And once that chase stops, the illusion breaks. They see how little they were being emotionally fed in return for how much they were giving. The silence from the other person becomes louder, more telling. The emotional effort that was once one-sided now demands reciprocity, and when it doesn't come, the imbalance is undeniable. This shift doesn't always lead to reconciliation. Often, it leads to realization. The anxious person sees that their value was never in how hard they could fight for someone, but in their ability to choose themselves when someone else wouldn't. And if the avoidant does try to re-engage, it's often on new terms. Terms that require them to meet in the middle instead of being chased. Because when one person stops running after love, the other has to decide to step forward or let it go. In the absence of chasing, the truth steps forward. And that truth, while sometimes painful, is always clarifying. When an anxiously attached person decides to stop chasing the avoidant, something profound happens internally and they begin to feel peace. Not immediately and not without discomfort, but slowly, space starts to open up inside them. Space that used to be filled with worry, rumination, and emotional overdrive. That space becomes the starting point for boundaries. For perhaps the first time, they realize that they don't have to keep earning love through self-abandonment. They don't have to keep adjusting themselves to fit someone else's inability to meet them emotionally. And in that realization, they begin to feel a sense of calm that was previously drowned out by constant anxiety. When someone is anxiously attached, their nervous system is often in a state of hypervigilance in relationships. They're constantly monitoring for signs of withdrawal, interpreting mixed signals, and trying to secure closeness before it's taken away. It's a pattern of preemptively managing loss. But when they step back and stop chasing, they break that cycle. And while the initial silence may feel unbearable, like a void filled with doubt and the fear of being forgotten, it eventually becomes the doorway to emotional clarity. This is where boundaries come in. Before, boundaries may have felt like a threat to connection. Saying no felt like a risk, asking for space felt selfish, and asking for more felt like too much. But when the anxious person stops pursuing the avoidant, they realize that boundaries are not barriers to love, they're requirements for it. Without them, there's only exhaustion, confusion, and resentment. But with them, peace starts to take root. That peace isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in subtle ways, sleeping better at night, no longer reading text messages for hidden meanings, or spending time in activities that aren't secretly just a distraction from anxiety. The relationship with self begins to heal. The anxious person starts tuning into their own emotional cues, asking themselves, do I feel safe with this person? Instead of, how can I make them stay? They become less focused on trying to decode someone else's emotional availability and more focused on honoring their own emotional needs. They begin to understand that love isn't supposed to come at the cost of their peace. In fact, real love enhances it. It feels like exhale, not tension. It's something you settle into, not something you constantly chase. And what's most powerful is that once peace enters the picture, the desire to chase naturally fades. This is not about giving up. It's not about growing up emotionally. It's no longer about waiting for someone to finally choose you. It becomes about choosing yourself enough to walk away from what doesn't feel good and trusting that love isn't something that requires you to be in emotional overdrive. That peace becomes the new baseline. And from there, any connection that doesn't align with that standard begins to feel less appealing, less magnetic, and far less worth the cost. In many anxious-avoidant dynamics, the anxious partner spends an incredible amount of time and emotional energy trying to be nof. They think if they can just say the right thing, look the right way, or love hard enough, they can finally earn the affection and security they crave. But that effort often becomes a one-sided performance, one where the anxious person is auditioning for a role they were never supposed to audition for in the first place. Real connection, however, isn't something that's earned through relentless effort. It's something that unfolds naturally when two people are emotionally available and willing to meet each other where they are. When the anxious partner begins to pull back, not out of manipulation, but from a place of clarity and self-protection, they begin to see the truth. They recognize that they were working too hard to compensate for someone else's emotional absence. They realize that love shouldn't require constant proof or performance. They begin to understand that the right person doesn't need to be convinced of their worth. They simply see it. This is a powerful shift The anxious person starts to stop over-functioning. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly to someone who isn't really listening. They stop waiting days for a reply, making excuses for why someone disappears, or hoping that inconsistency is just a phase. Instead, they start to notice how they feel around the person. Do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? Do they feel calm or constantly on edge? Love, at its core, should feel like safety. That doesn't mean it's always easy or perfect, but it does mean there's mutual effort, emotional presence, and a willingness to communicate even when it's uncomfortable. When one person is constantly trying to prove themselves, it creates an imbalance where love feels conditional. I'll be loved if I do this, or I'll finally be chosen when I become that. This mindset keeps people locked in a cycle of insecurity, thinking they're the problem, when in reality, the problem is the dynamic they're trying to hold together by themselves. When the anxious person finally recognizes that they don't have to perform to be loved, they take back their power. They stop chasing chemistry with someone emotionally distant and start seeking compatibility, someone who actually wants to connect, who shows up consistently, who doesn't confuse intimacy with suffocation. The anxious person realizes that love doesn't have to feel like anxiety and guessing. It can feel like knowing. And in that knowing, they find relief. They begin to understand that the person who's right for them won't need to be chased, fixed, or decoded. They won't have to keep proving that they're worthy of closeness. The right person won't run when things get real, they'll lean in. The performance ends, and in its place is a new foundation, one built on mutual effort, shared emotional responsibility, and respect. That's not just healthier, that's real love. Walking away from a relationship where one person is constantly chasing while the other remains emotionally distant can feel like one of the most difficult decisions an anxiously attached person can make. It's not a choice that's taken lightly, and it often comes after months or even years of emotional struggle. But in the moment of stepping away, something transformative happens. The anxious partner realizes that they've been choosing to stay in a dynamic that undermines their own well-being. They begin to understand that sometimes healing doesn't happen by fixing a relationship. It happens by releasing it. The key to this shift is the realization that love isn't supposed to feel like a battlefield. It's not meant to be a constant test of endurance where you're always trying to prove your worth, win over affection, or gain the approval of someone who isn't meeting you halfway. In an anxious-avoidant relationship, the anxious person often gets caught in the belief that if they just do more, try harder, or sacrifice more, they'll eventually receive the love and security they crave. But what they fail to see is that this effort often comes at the cost of their own emotional health and self-respect. The truth is, choosing yourself isn't about giving up on love. It's about understanding that love should never cost you your peace. When you walk away from a dynamic where one person is emotionally unavailable, you're not abandoning the hope of connection. You're choosing to stop sacrificing yourself for the possibility of something that isn't fully reciprocated. Walking away doesn't mean giving up on love. It means choosing a love that chooses you back freely, without hesitation or the need to earn it. It's the moment when the anxious person finally lets go of the belief that their worth depends on winning someone's affection, and they realize that they are enough, just as they are. In choosing yourself, you start to rebuild the emotional foundation that may have been lost in the pursuit of someone who couldn't give you what you needed. You begin to prioritize your own emotional health over the desire to please, win, or convince. You focus on your own growth, rediscovering the things that make you feel grounded, whole, and secure. You reconnect with the parts of yourself that were buried under the constant need to prove yourself. Whether it's pursuing a new passion, spending more time with friends, or simply enjoying your own company, this is the space where healing begins. You learn that your peace doesn't have to be dependent on someone else's ability to love you. Furthermore, walking away allows you to reclaim your emotional power. No longer bound by the cycle of chasing and waiting, you now have the freedom to decide what you will and won't tolerate in relationships. Your standards begin to shift. Instead of accepting crumbs or second-hand love, you start to recognize your own worth and realize that you deserve someone who is emotionally available, who can meet you where you are, and who is willing to put in the effort to build a healthy, balanced relationship. And by walking away, you send a powerful message to yourself and others. You are not willing to settle for anything less than the love you deserve. In this process of self-empowerment, you also begin to see relationships through a different lens. You understand that real connection isn't about making someone love you. It's about finding someone who wants to love you, who's ready to meet you with equal effort, emotional investment, and respect. And in this newfound clarity, you recognize that walking away from the wrong relationship isn't an act of weakness. It's an act of strength, self-respect, and an affirmation that you deserve a love that doesn't require endless proving. Thank you all for taking the time to reflect on this today. Remember, choosing yourself is never the wrong choice. It's the most powerful one you can make. Don't settle for less than the love you deserve, because when you stop chasing, you allow space for the right kind of connection to flow to you. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and let go of anything that drains your spirit. Goodbye, and thank you again for your time and openness. Take care of yourselves.